Welcome to Renegade Inc., the show that allows us to think differently. Dismissing something as fake news has become a universal way to shut down conversation that doesn't fit your worldview or political agenda. This device has become so prevalent that the words fake news were recently voted Term of the Year. But what if fake news is nothing new? What if throughout history, every ruling class has manipulated information to maintain control of people's minds? Is what is omitted, unsaid and unreported also fake news? But more personally, does calling something fake news actually give us an insight into our own and other people's underlying assumptions? Joining me to discuss our fake news epidemic are the author and associate researcher at the Organisation for Propaganda Studies, Dr. Tim Coles, and the senior lecturer at Birkbeck University of London, Justin Schlossberg. Gentlemen, welcome. Thank you very much for doing this. Tim, start with you. You've written the book Real Fake News, and you've amazingly gone back to Babylonian times. I mean, if we want historical context from fake news, and what you're asserting is that fake news has always been with us. It's just now that the volume, if you like, has been turned up on it. Give us that historical context and why it's always been around.
Well, news and information is a source of power. It's basically a weapon against the general public. And there are really two kinds of information. There's the information that those in power project and give to the public to try and tell them how to think and what to think about and what not to think about. There's also the information that's gathered about the public, hence the surveillance state. In more recent times, we're seeing the use of both of those kinds of information to gather information about what you think from surveillance and then to target information to you. But at least historically, information was pretty one-directional in the sense that, say, the elites of ancient Babylon would pretend on stone tablets that they were descended from gods and things like that in order to try and frighten the public into obeying laws. And this theme of spreading fake news from the top down as a means of social control, it appeared in Egypt and Greece with the Platonic idea of the noble lie.
Explain what the noble lie is.
So the idea of the noble lie is that we, the elites, whoever we are at a particular time, should be able to lie to the public for our own benefit and for the public's sake. The public need to be lied to. And
why? Because they can't look after themselves. We've got to make decisions for them.
Exactly. It will undermine our power otherwise. But also the elites tend to think of the public as being like children. They have to be kept in fantasies and fairy stories. And this idea of top-down fake news, you can find traces of it throughout history. It's absolutely nothing new, despite what we're told. What is new is the fact that so much information is now so readily available. I mean, the advent of the printing press was revolutionary, and the internet in some ways is comparable to that. So,
do you think it is a sort of Gutenberg moment, the internet? And actually, the fake news, the reason why the volume has been turned up on the fake news stories is because people can actually go out and cross-check. So the high priests, if you like, the media, can't stand in the way of you and the knowledge, the actual knowledge.
Yeah, and there are massive efforts to guide people into certain directions with the internet.
Like what? Can you give an example, a practical example?
Well, the new algorithms on certain search engines, for example, have been directing people away from very well-sourced, legitimate alternative sources. So the American Civil Liberties Union, Amnesty International, antiwar.com, Truth Out, Counterpunch, they've seen in the last few years a massive decline in internet traffic. And that's because there are algorithms being used to divert people away and to base everything on popularity rather than on specific key phrases that you might be looking for.
I agree with Tim's analysis broadly, and I think the historical context is an incredibly important and much needed contribution to the fake news debate. However, I do think that sometimes there is a tendency to over-egg the impact of algorithms, the impact of bots, the impact of the kind of toxic interaction, if you like, between certainly far-right partisan news outlets and these algorithms. In terms of fake news, if we think of fake news as wholly fabricated news stories,
Yes.
it's very rare that a wholly fabricated news story permeates the mainstream news agenda in a way that reaches critical mass audiences. Very often they have viral spread, but viral spread usually amongst people who are already pretty much persuaded in terms of their political attitude and vantage point. I think the news that we really need to be worried about, which I think Tim suggested and in his book, is that the news on the likes of the BBC, on the CNNs, precisely because they have this profound reach across fragmented audiences.
So here's what you're saying, is that with that level of reach, that scale, actually you can cover a way bigger area, a much bigger canvas, if you like, and that's a worry because?
Well, it's a different type of problem. It's not necessarily what I would call fake news, but there is absolutely a problem with disinformation. Right. And disinformation being what I would call the systematic distortions and inaccuracies that privilege a particular ideological or partisan worldview.
Right. Can you give us an example of one?
Well, the report that I produced for the Media Reform Coalition last year on coverage of anti-Semitism within the British Labour Party documents exactly this kind of consistent misquotations, absence of right of reply, assertions of blatant, unambiguous falsehoods that are not challenged or corrected by correspondents or presenters or journalists, and in fact sometimes uttered by those journalists themselves.
Oh, gosh.
So that's the kind of thing that I think is really deeply problematic. It's more subtle, it's less obvious than what we might call fake news, but potentially more pervasive.
And when you talk about an ideology, for instance, with that story, what are people trying to achieve with it?
Well, I think in the case of anti-Semitism, it is difficult because I do believe that there are genuine concerns about anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, that anti-Semitism is a problem in the Labour Party, as it is in other places. But I think it's also very safe to say that there are people who have been, from the outset of Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party, intent on throwing whatever mud at him that they can find. And needless to say, this did present an opportunity to do that. And so when you have potentially very influential sources within the Labour Party that are continually briefing the news media and making statements that are simply factually incorrect, like, for example, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism has been adopted by virtually every country in the world. To date, it's only been formally adopted by 8 countries. These are just examples of routine inaccuracies that are peddled not just on the margins of news discourse, but on the very shows and on the very platforms, that flagship bulletins that reach those critical mass audiences. And that's the real problem, because it's those audiences that includes people, the so-called swing voters, who are the real kingmakers of democracy. They may be less engaged relatively, they may have less prior knowledge of a particular issue, and when they're being fed this kind of disinformation, that can potentially have, I think, a more profound impact on political elections, for example, than anything that someone like Cambridge Analytica can claim to achieve.
It depends, of course, how we define fake news. It's a very broad spectrum. So at the one end, you've got obvious things that not many people take seriously, like clickbait. But then as we move across the spectrum, it becomes a little more subtle. So the intelligence agencies, for example, have the 3 modes of propaganda, black, white, and grey, where white propaganda is simply the state making its case. They might be lying, but at least you know who's making it and why. Grey propaganda, the lines get a bit more blurred and doubt is seeded. And black propaganda is simply putting words in enemies' mouths that they didn't say. And then across the other end of the spectrum, which I think is by far the most important and pervasive, is the propaganda of omission. It's what is not said. If you're given facts and information, you can counter it. But if you're not told key information and analysis, you can't even think about certain things. For example, with the Yellow Vest protesters in France, that all of the context of French neoliberalism and this slow effort to privatize and stagnating wages and so on, all of that omitted. So when the protests finally kick off, we're given this picture that it's some bunch of extremists who didn't want to pay more for fuel.
Why does that happen?
I think it goes back to the issue of wanting to alienate the public from their own interests. If people in the UK were given the background, the context, the information about why people who support the so-called far left and the so-called far right in France are actually coming together against what Tariq Ali calls the extreme centre, these centrist institutions, it might inspire the public to form their own yellow vest protests, which they're now doing in the UK. Fortunately, some left-wing elements and supporters of the right wing are coming together, so it's not just a right-wing cause in the UK. That's pretty frightening for elites. Whenever people in power tell you that fake news is undermining democracy, they really mean that alternative sources of information are challenging their grip on power.
I think we have to be mindful and sensitive to the complexities of what we might call elitism in our society. I mean, I agree fundamentally with the thesis that elites have more in common than that which divides them. But
yes,
we also have to acknowledge that we are living in a world where there are some pretty fundamental fractures within elite ranks, most obviously surfaced through Brexit, through the election of Trump. But I think it's also important that we understand that when we talk about top-down propaganda, that exists in certain contexts, clearly. That there are clearly elements of the security state that have always been focused on fighting what's called information wars, which is a slightly nicer term for propaganda. But there are also other aspects of elites, of elite society that are not playing that game, that are playing a different game, that in their minds they are not at all part of, journalists for one, do not see themselves as part of any kind of neoliberal, overarching neoliberal imperialist agenda. Journalists, even within news organisations like RT and Russia One, believe in some ways quite legitimately, that they are providing a credible, independent news service, right? But what we have to be sensitive to are the particular ways in which the practice of journalism becomes compromised, sometimes at the margins, sometimes fundamentally. The reality is the BBC, The Guardian, CNN, every so often do good journalism. So does RT. Even Russia One does good journalism, right? But we have to understand the different ways in which they are all compromised. And until we do that, we're never really going to overcome this problem of fake news, disinformation, or whatever else we call it.
Welcome back to Renegade Inc., the show that allows us to think differently. Before we talk more with Dr. Tim Coles and Justin Schlossberg about fake news, let's have a look at what you've been tweeting about in this week's Renegade Inc. Index. First up, we got a tweet from Lee Camp. Corporate media, talking heads can be a lying bag of corporate sellouts, and Trump can be a lying conman. Both are true at the same time. Next from Mark Curtis, here is the Mail's contribution to the Daily Mail to 26 people owning as much as half the world's population. As Oxfam says, when someone comes along proposing mild distributive reform in the UK, they're denounced as comrade, Marxist and radical left-wing. This is the neoliberal playbook, isn't it? What do you think?
Yeah, you have to alienate the public from anything that might actually help them.
Next from Craig Murray, the realisation has only really just struck me hard that the people who have been most vocal in making totally false claims that I am in any way paid by Russia were themselves being secretly paid to make those claims by my former employer, the FCO, that's the Foreign Commonwealth Office, via the Integrity Initiative.
There's nothing surprising about that revelation, yet it's always shocking to find that there are agents or agencies of the state that are involved in this kind of political and ideological propaganda. But I think even worse than the problem itself is the fundamentally lack or absence of any kind of sanction or accountability.
And finally, from WikiLeaks, at Catherine Viner, it's the editor of The Guardian, US prosecutors interrogated a dozen Ecuador London diplomats today and last week over The Guardian's front page fabricated story that Assange had secret meetings with Manafort. Reuters, AFP, EFE put out newswires. Big news, but censored from The Guardian readers. Why?
Anything to make people afraid of scary Russia. Anything that can link politicians or whistleblowers or journalists or academics to the Kremlin has to be played up. And there's a case where we can see the media really following a particular line and setting a very clear agenda.
I'll be very blunt in my assessment. Al Jazeera is winning. The Chinese have opened up a global English language and multi-language television network. The Russians have opened up an English language network. I've seen it in a few countries, and it's quite instructive. During the Cold War, we did a great job in getting America's message out. After the Berlin Wall fell, we said, okay, fine, enough of that. You know, we've done it, we're done. And unfortunately, we are paying a big price for it. And our private media cannot fill that gap. In fact, our private media, particularly cultural programming, often works at counter purposes to what we truly are as Americans and what our values are. I remember having an Afghan general tell me that the only thing he thought about Americans is that all the men wrestled and the women walked around in bikinis, because the only TV he ever saw was Baywatch and Worldwide Wrestling.
There's an honesty to that clip, because at least she's going in front of Congress and saying, look, we've got to do this. What do you make of it?
Yeah, in that sense, it's kind of refreshing, because it's saying what is probably true, that America has always been, certainly during the Cold War, and indeed we're now seeing renewed efforts to fight the information war, the propaganda war. I think that's true of all states, though.
Right.
I think.
Well, you come back to Babylonia.
Well, exactly, and I think we kind of need to be mindful of the ways in which this plays out in different geopolitical contexts. The truth is, what Hillary said on that clip, Al Jazeera does some very good news, right? It doesn't in any way cover the Qatari royal establishment with any kind of critical scrutiny. The BBC does some good news. It's been absolutely appalling in covering the proxy war that the UK has been fighting for a number of years in Yemen, for example. The same thing can be said of CNN. The same thing can be said of RT in respect of some of the Kremlin's activities. So I think what we need to be careful of is not thinking of this in a sort of slightly reductive way as being purely a problem to do with Western media propaganda. I mean, I think what is interesting is that, notwithstanding that clip from Hillary, traditionally it's been much less apparent how propaganda works in the Western media, and arguably more effective because of that.
Right.
Because it's been much more subtle, it's been less instructive, less what we call, in kind of boring academic terms, the work of agency rather than structure.
Right.
But I think we're entering a world now, particularly where Western hegemony, cultural, economic, military hegemony is being challenged probably more profoundly than it ever has before, where we need to be sensitive to how it works on all sides.
This really comes to a point in your book where you talk about school, and what I'm getting at is inculcation might be too strong, maybe indoctrination, but ultimately it's cognitive map. Is it the case that the propaganda drive, the fake news drive, the disinformation, however you want to describe it, does it start back somewhere else, the lack of critical thinking?
Oh, sure. In fact, Winston Churchill said that school is less to do with education and more to do with inculcating values. I think that's pretty accurate. And the values, of course, depend on the state in question, right, and also the class. So the kind of education that's given to the upper classes is going to be different to the education that's given to the lower classes. And in fact, in terms of propaganda, if we look at the structure of the media, we see that if you look at social mobility studies, editors tend to come from upper classes, and so they're shaping their interests of their own class. Although journalists obviously do great work, they're rather constrained by editorial policy in many cases. So the indoctrination goes a long way, and it's another form of psychological warfare against the public. Education, information, the economy can be a form of warfare. Law, what you're allowed to do or not do. So these things play a myriad of sort of like a 3 or 4 pronged assault where different elements are coming at you from the top down.
The fact that we're having this conversation now and the fact that there is so much chatter online and in the mainstream about this fake news epidemic, really, does that mean that we've reached sort of peak fake news, and actually by identifying that you can start to do something about it? I mean, is the solution in the problem?
Unfortunately not, because unfortunately a lot of the discourse around fake news and disinformation is itself tantamount to fake news and disinformation. I think
confusing stuff, this, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I mean, the most obvious being the way in which people like Donald Trump throw the term at any kind of news that kind of doesn't support his agenda. But I think you can see that also more subtly in the way that, for example, fake news is articulated or disinformation is articulated on the opinion pages of The Guardian, where it's very much conceived as a problem for which respectable news outlets like The Guardian and the BBC are supposedly the antidote, that it's coming from this kind of toxic interaction between Breitbart's Facebook algorithms and Kremlin-controlled bots. And I think, so I think actually, that, bizarrely, the real problem that we're facing at the moment is the way in which disinformation has really permeated the very discussion of disinformation. And I think the only way we can get through that is by encouraging people to think critically about all of the news and information that they consume.
A lot of people are knowledge hungry but time poor. How do you counteract that?
Well, what I try to always tell my students is to develop what I would call a healthy skepticism. We should never operate on the assumption that anything that's print gets any kind of column inch or airtime is just nonsense.
Right. Because then you end up in the conspiracy loony.
Exactly, and we shouldn't operate on the assumption that it's gospel. We need to be sensitive and critical to the different agendas that are at play, particularly in the kinds of political controversies that are pervasive now all over the world, but especially within Western liberal democracies. We've reached this kind of post-consensus age where the kind of ideological glue that used to tie things together in terms of news agendas has disintegrated, really. And so that presents as many problems in terms of the opportunities for disinformation to surface in mainstream news agendas as it does opportunities, because people are, I think, increasingly being exposed to ideas, as you mentioned at the start, that were previously omitted from these kinds of platforms.
Justin mentions the ideological glue. From a historical context point of view, is the ideological glue that's coming apart at the moment the neoliberal agenda, because people ironically can't afford neoliberalism anymore, which is why we see the Gilets jaunes out?
That's part of it, and omitting the context is essential, but also as the alternative media challenge the mainstream in some ways are trying to absorb the alternative. So we now see guests on what's mislabeled the far left, like the Canary.co or Novara Media, being invited as pundits on Newsnight on the BBC or on Sky. So instead of just ignoring it, they're now trying to absorb them into sort of the competition, as it were.
And why is that happening?
I think it's partly to do with ratings, and there's been a decline in trust in mainstream media, a steady decline, and people are looking to alternative sources. But it's also to do with making sure that particular class agendas, and as we were saying earlier, there's not just one agenda or one elite, there are multiple ones, that they are well served. So if you were to go onto some of these alternative websites, you could get their perspective, but if you're encountering them on a mainstream program, they're speaking within the framework of mainstream debate.
Right.
So you've got, they don't have much time to speak, there are multiple guests, so they're shouted down. The kind of questions and agenda are already set before they come on the show, so they're not allowed to speak freely. And that's really one of the main problems, is how the mainstream are structured. These are private institutions and state institutions, or sometimes both, a mix of both. If we compare British media to European media, it's very right-wing, according to studies that have looked into this.
As we conclude, I often bump into people who say, proudly, I don't have a television anymore, because they've realised that they've had this glass teat, as it can be called, in the corner of their room, lying to them for however many years. How do you, because you need to work hard to keep a democracy vital, what do you say to people, what do you say to a person on the street about what's happening in the media space, the fake news space, and all the rest of it now? Given the historical context that it's always been with us, what do you say to them so that they can protect themselves or they can make the right decisions when it comes to either voting or policy decisions? What do you say to them about how to navigate this?
I said first and most important thing is to challenge your own assumptions. If you have particular assumptions about what the other side thinks, what the other side does, then more than likely those assumptions have been reinforced by some kind of narrative that you've consumed somewhere in the media.
And you've reconfirmed over time.
Right. So the first thing to do is actually not to think about necessarily even the media we consume, but what are our own prevailing underlying assumptions about, for example, the political landscape as it is today, and challenge them. And
so it starts with introspection.
I think so. I think that's the only way we can get through any of these kinds of debates, and it extends even beyond, the issue of fake news and disinformation into the related problem of deep polarization within our society. And until we are willing to kind of look inward and be self-reflexive and self-critical about it or question our own positions, then there's no hope for the kind of public sphere kind of discourse that democracies really need.
Isn't that a really excellent point? This idea that there's one finger constantly pointing out, but there are three pointing back, and actually the introspection is going to be the thing that delivers the critical thought and also all the other good stuff that goes with that.
Yeah, that's one of the big keys. Do you want to know the truth, or do you merely want to find comfort in your own echo chamber?
Gentlemen, thank you both very much for your contribution. That's it from Renegade Inc. this week. You can drop the team a mail, studio@renegadeinc.com, or you can tweet us @Renegade Inc. Join us next week for more insight from those people who are thinking differently. But until then, stay curious.